Okay, so today we're going to be looking into sugar relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And when you hear that term, maybe you have this picture in your head of like
Right.
a really specific kind of arrangement, but we're going to find out that it's actually a lot more complicated than that.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be using as our main source for today's deep dive
Okay.
research by Marin T. Scull. This is based on interviews with 48 women in the U.S.
Got it.
And this whole thing started when I was reading some research by Roe v. Wade from back in 2009,
Okay.
and he had this idea of like a negotiated exchange. That's how he defined these relationships.
Interesting.
So you have one person offering intimacy, companionship, maybe their time, their attention,
Right.
and the other person is providing personal benefits like financial support.
Yeah. And that financial aspect is what really grabs people's attention. Right?
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
It's what makes these relationships stand out, but there's so much more to it than just the money.
Right.
And one of the things that's been really interesting to me is how much more research is being done on sugar relationships lately, especially in places like the US, Canada, the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a bit of a shift because, early research on this kind of exchange
Yeah.
really focused on transactional sex in Africa and compensated dating in Asia.
Right.
But now we're seeing this growing body of work
Yeah.
looking at sugar relationships in Western societies, and it's becoming a really important area of study.
Yeah, and when people think about sugar relationships, the first thing that might come to mind
Yeah.
is that they're exploitative, they're disempowering.
That's a common reaction,
Yeah.
for sure. And to be fair, there is research that backs that up. Like,
Yeah.
Burkass, Henriksen, and Frizzler Thompson, Miller, Patel, they've all done some work on this.
Yeah.
And they highlight the risks involved, especially that financial imbalance you mentioned.
Right.
And how that can create a situation where one person might have way too much influence over the other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's where the research by Scull is so valuable, right?
Definitely.
Because it really dives into those power dynamics.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at that specifically from the perspective of the women in her study.
Right.
So we really want to get to the bottom of how they understand power in these relationships, how they navigate it, and what makes them feel empowered versus disempowered.
I think you're going to find this really interesting because what Scull found was that it's messy. It's not clear-cut. Like, these women didn't always agree on what power looked like.
Yeah.
Or which experiences were empowering and which weren't.
Right.
And sometimes, even in the same situation, a woman would describe feeling both strong and kind of vulnerable at the same time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It really challenges our assumptions about how power works in these relationships.
So essentially what you're saying is these sugar relationships, the power dynamics can be pretty complicated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest takeaway from the study is that power can be both oppressive and emboldening. It's not one or the other.
Okay.
It's like this double-edged sword, And that actually connects to some broader ideas about power in society. Like, think about Andermar and Cotter. They talk about how power isn't just about one person controlling another.
Okay.
Sometimes, even when it looks like someone is giving in or submitting, there can be empowering effects, especially if it helps them navigate difficult circumstances.
So let's get into the specifics of how Scull actually broke down these different ways of thinking about power.
Right, so in the study, she identifies three main categories. First, there's what she calls power over.
Power over.
Which is pretty straightforward. It's about having control or influence over someone else.
Okay.
Then there's power to.
Power to.
Which is more about your own ability to make choices and take action.
Got it.
And then there's the darker side. Power is domination.
Power is domination.
And that's when you're talking about being controlled or oppressed.
So in terms of power over, how did these women feel like they had power over their benefactors?
Okay, so there were three main ways they exerted that power. The first, and probably the most obvious, was through money.
Okay.
I mean, it makes sense, right? It's a sugar relationship.
Right.
The exchange of financial support is kind of at the heart of it.
Yeah, so they had power over their benefactors by getting money from them.
It wasn't just about getting money, though.
Okay.
It was about having a say in that financial support. Like, how much they would get, what it would be used for.
Right. So it wasn't just like a set salary every week.
Yeah, exactly. It could be a one-time payment, like for a specific expense.
Okay.
It could be a regular allowance, or it could be gifts.
And those gifts could be like anything.
Yeah, pretty much anything. Clothes, jewelry, handbags.
Okay.
Some even got help with rent or tuition.
Wow.
Car payments, even elaborate birthday parties for their kids, the whole range.
That's a pretty wide spectrum of financial support.
Yeah, and it gave them a lot of flexibility.
So for our listeners who are curious, how easy was it for these women to actually get that support?
Well, most of them, about 73%, said it was pretty easy,
Okay.
especially if they had a good rapport with their benefactor or if
Yeah.
the benefactor was, emotionally attached.
So it wasn't always a battle?
Not necessarily,
Yeah.
but feeling powerful because of that money was another thing.
Okay.
It really depended on their own financial situation outside of the relationship.
Can you give us an example? Like, how did that play out for some of the women?
Sure. So like Charlotte, she was 20
Okay.
and she felt powerful because she wasn't financially dependent on her benefactor. She knew she could walk away if she wanted to, and they gave her a sense of agency.
Right.
But then there's Evelyn. She was 18,
Okay.
and she felt empowered by getting her benefactor to spoil her.
Interesting.
She enjoyed having that influence, It made her feel more confident.
So both getting the money and being able to walk away were empowering.
Yeah, it was a different flavor of empowerment, but it was there.
But I imagine there were times when getting that financial support wasn't so easy.
Oh, absolutely. Like when women felt financially reliant on their benefactor, that's when things got tricky.
Okay.
They often felt disempowered.
Right.
Like Natalie, for instance. She was a student at a private university, and she felt like she couldn't speak up if her benefactor didn't pay her
Oh, wow.
because she needed that money to stay in school.
Right.
And then there's Melissa. She had to constantly badger this benefactor of hers, who she described as curmudgeonly, just to get the money he promised.
Wow.
She felt like he was holding back funds on purpose just to control her.
That's not a good feeling.
No, not at all.
Mm.
And then, of course, there were more extreme cases that felt like straight-up exploitation.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, Samantha's experience was pretty awful. She had this encounter with a benefactor,
Okay.
and afterwards, he didn't hear anything.
Wow.
And she was furious. She felt completely used. She went online, did some research, confronted him about it.
So she really felt that sense of violation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's even a term within the sugar dating community
Okay.
for benefactors like that, the ones who promise financial support but then withhold it.
What's that?
They call them salt daddies.
Salt daddies. Okay. So we've talked about money. What were some of the other ways that these women felt they had power over?
Well, the second way was through controlling their time and attention.
Okay.
A surprisingly large percentage of the women, about 75%, felt they had power by deciding how much time and attention they'd give to the relationship.
Interesting.
And this included everything, from texting and phone calls to meeting up for shopping, dates, hanging out with each other's families, even going on vacations.
Okay, so controlling their schedules was a big deal for them.
Yeah, like Tabitha, she specifically said that the relationship was on my watch, meaning she would only spend time with her benefactor when it was convenient for her.
So she was setting the boundaries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just like with the money, some of them actually used their time and attention strategically.
Okay, how so?
Well, like Monica, she would intentionally give her benefactor less attention, hoping that he'd increase her weekly allowance.
So a bit of a power play.
Yeah, exactly. But then there was Lydia. Her situation was pretty unique.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned her before.
Yeah, she actually felt empowered by having very little contact with her benefactor,
Okay.
who, by the way, she thought was creepy.
Hmm.
But she was still getting money from him. They hadn't seen each other in like 3 years.
And he was still sending her money.
Yep. But here's the thing. This whole relationship started when she was 13
Oh, wow.
and he was 30.
Okay, that's a whole other layer to this.
It is. And she actually had this funny but kind of dark quote about it.
What was it?
She said the biggest benefit was getting a few dollars without having to see his face.
Oh, wow.
Which, it's funny, but it also shows how complicated it can be.
Like, she felt empowered in a way, but the whole situation was still pretty exploitative.
Right. It really highlights how these things can coexist.
Exactly.
Okay, so I've covered money. We've covered time and attention. What's the third way these women felt they had power over?
Well, the third way was, it might seem a bit obvious, but it's their looks.
Oh, okay.
About 69% of them talked about using their beauty to their advantage.
Hmm.
And this included everything, their face, hair, body size, fitness, youth, even their ethnicity.
So it's almost like their appearance became a kind of currency.
Yeah, you could say that, especially for those who were using sugar dating websites.
Right, right.
Like Lynn, she talked about how she cultivated this girl next door image
Okay.
and presented herself as a college student to attract benefactors.
Mm. And was there any discussion of race and how that played into this currency of appearance?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the women even pointed out that being white could be a form of currency in this world.
Wow.
Like Evelyn, she talked about witnessing racism on these sites.
And how some benefactors seem to prefer white, average, cheap girls.
That's really disturbing.
Yeah, it's a harsh reality. And Holly, who is African American,
Okay.
she really disliked the term brown sugar baby and felt like darker-skinned women were often at the bottom of the totem pole when it came to attracting benefactors.
So there's this whole hierarchy within the sugar dating world.
It seems like it, yeah. Holly even talked about how hard it was for her to find someone. And she actually considered straightening her hair for her profile pictures
Oh, wow.
because she didn't want to look too black.
That's really sad.
Yeah, and it makes you think about research on the hair dilemma for black women in professional settings.
Right.
Like, it shows how these societal expectations around appearance, they're racialized,
Yeah,
and they even play out in these unconventional relationships.
absolutely. And you said that Casey also felt she had to work harder.
Yeah, Casey is black and plus size, and she felt like she had to put in way more effort. And she believed that women of color basically had to be a 6 and above at all times just to be considered.
So there was a lot of pressure to conform to certain beauty standards.
Definitely. But it's important to note that these pressures weren't always as strong in relationships that started offline. And some women found success on those niche websites,
All right.
the ones specifically for people who identify as BBW.
So there are alternatives. It's not all about fitting into one specific mold.
No, not at all. And then there's Janet. Her experience really challenges that whole idea.
Okay, how so?
Well, she was able to make a lot of money despite describing herself as overweight, average, just normal. And she felt empowered by that. Like, she didn't fit that stereotypical sugar baby image,
Right.
but she was still successful.
So it's more nuanced than just fitting into a specific look.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about power over.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to power two.
Right.
And how that sometimes intersected with those more negative experiences of power as domination.
Okay, so remember, power 2 is about being able to make your own choices, having agency.
Right.
And in this study, that really came through in two main areas. One was how these women control their sexual interactions,
Okay.
and the other was in relation to their safety.
Right.
But when those areas turned negative, when there was pressure or harm,
Yeah.
that's where power as domination came in.
So let's start with sexual interactions. Obviously sex is a big part of many of these relationships.
Yeah, about 60% of the women in this study had some kind of sexual interaction with their benefactor.
Okay.
And a large majority of those, about 83%, felt like they were in control of those interactions.
So for them, their sexuality was a source of power.
It was, yeah. A lot of them felt empowered by being able to use sex to get money.
Oh.
Some even refer to it as pussy power.
Pussy power?
Like Tracy, she felt like men were inherently disempowered by their desire for sex. And Samantha felt the same way, like she had something they wanted, and that gave her power. And Camille, she was even more direct. She said, the sugar baby actually has all of the power.
Wow.
When it came to the sexual aspect of the relationship.
So it's this whole flip of the script on traditional power dynamics.
Yeah, it really is.
And did all of the women who received financial support have sex with their benefactors?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Some of them got payments and gifts even without sexual encounters.
Okay.
But there was a smaller group, about 15%, where the payment was specifically tied to sexual acts.
So that's what Scull calls sugar prostitution.
Exactly. And those arrangements tended to be more problematic.
Right. But even among those who did have sex with their benefactors, the feeling of being in control wasn't universal, was it?
No, definitely not. About 17% of them reported feeling pressured, manipulated, even coerced. And, it's important to mention that no one reported being raped within these relationships.
Okay.
But there were definitely cases of unwanted behavior, often related to fetishes.
Right. So let's talk about fetishes. That seems like a really sensitive and potentially complicated area.
It is, yeah. So 29% of the women had benefactors with specific fetishes.
Okay.
And these ranged wide.
What kind of things are we talking about?
Oh, everything.
Yeah.
Body parts, objects, situations, behaviors, you name it.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay, so some were into BDSM, some were into role-playing, like superhero stuff.
Okay.
Some had fetishes for things like coins, diapers, pantyhose. There was even one guy who's into tiny people.
Tiny people.
Yeah, like people with dwarfism. And then some had fetishes for, watching someone eat.
Okay.
And this is a bit disturbing, but there was even a case of a rape fetish.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And what's interesting is that when Scull started doing these interviews, she wasn't even asking about fetishes, but they kept coming up. It was clearly an important part of many of these women's experiences.
So how did they feel about these fetishes? Were they generally okay with it?
Well, it varied a lot, person to person. Most of them didn't mind participating. Some were even into it. But about half of them did report having negative feelings about a fetish at some point.
Right.
And sometimes, even those who had positive experiences with certain fetishes had negative ones with others.
Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, like Charlotte, she talked about this safe fetish, where her benefactor liked to receive photos of her in layers of clothes.
Yeah, okay.
So for her, that was something she was comfortable with.
Right.
And then Kathy, she's quite petite, and she had a benefactor with a tiny person fetish. And she felt like her size made it easier to enact that fetish.
So it aligned with her own self-image in a way.
Yeah, in a way. And Lynn, who considered herself pretty open-minded,
Okay.
she had a professor with a lingerie fetish and another benefactor who wanted oral sex in his office.
Wow.
And she didn't seem too bothered by it. She felt like there was low risk in those situations.
So there's a spectrum of comfort levels and perceived risks.
Absolutely. But then there were those negative experiences too. Like Gina, she felt really distressed when her benefactor pressured her to humiliate him as part of his fetish. And Becca's experience with the guy who had a rape fetish, that was particularly disturbing.
Yeah, that sounds really upsetting.
It was. She definitely felt a lack of control and fear during those encounters.
So in her case, power as domination was really evident.
Yeah, but here's the twist. She actually felt like that experience, in a way, helped her during a real-life attempted rape.
Wow, how so?
She said it kind of conditioned her to fight back.
Oh, wow.
She explained that she felt conditioned to defend herself.
That's a really unexpected outcome.
It is. I mean, it was a terrible experience, but it somehow became a source of empowerment for her in a completely different context.
Right, so even within a situation that was clearly harmful, there can be this complex interplay of disempowerment and empowerment.
Exactly. And it shows how individual perception and context can really shape the experience of power.
So we've talked about fetishes. Were there other instances of women feeling pressured or coerced into sexual acts?
Yeah, about 17% of the women who had sexual relationships reported feeling that way.
Okay.
So that's 5 women in total. And Nicole's story is probably the most extreme example in the whole study, aside from actual sex trafficking.
Oh, wow. What happened?
Okay, so she had this benefactor who was really wealthy.
Okay.
And it started with him asking her to shave his back. But then it escalated. He forced her to be nude.
Oh, wow.
And engaged in manual stimulation.
That's awful.
It is. And she felt like she had to go on with it because she needed the money.
Right.
And also because she thought it was part of some weird game he was playing with his wife.
Okay.
And there was this detail about the door being poorly locked. And the wife eventually finding out, confronting Nicole.
Wow.
And then Nicole ended up losing her job because of it.
That's just a terrible situation all around.
Yeah, it's a really clear case of sexual coercion.
So we've talked about power, too, in the context of sex, but the study also looked at this idea of power to be safe, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Safety is a big concern in any relationship, but even more so in these arrangements.
Right.
Where there can be such big power imbalances.
So how did that play out in the research?
Well, it was really interesting when the women talked about experiencing violence, stalking, sexual harassment. That's when power as domination really came into play.
And were those common experiences?
Thankfully, violence wasn't very common. Only about 4% of the women reported experiencing physical or emotional abuse.
Okay.
But even those few cases were pretty serious. Like Amber, she talked about being abused when she tried to end the relationship.
Oh, wow.
And Jasmine was actually afraid for her life because her benefactor became violent when he saw her texting other people.
Those are some scary situations.
Yeah, really scary.
Right.
And stalking was another issue. About 8% of the women experienced that.
Wow.
Usually after trying to break up with or distance themselves from a benefactor.
Right.
Like Colleen, she talked about her benefactor following her, knowing her movements, showing up at her work, even after she changed her phone number.
That's really unsettling.
Yeah, it's invasive and frightening. And then there was sexual harassment, which was unfortunately more common.
How many women experienced that?
About 23% of them mentioned experiencing verbal or nonverbal sexual harassment.
Okay.
So things like lewd comments, unwanted touching, even benefactors masturbating in public.
Wow, that's awful.
Yeah, and a lot of them felt like they had to tolerate it because they needed the money.
Right, so it's that classic dilemma of feeling trapped.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like Celeste, she was pregnant at the time,
Okay.
and she felt really uncomfortable with her benefactor making sexual comments about her pregnancy. But she felt stuck because of her financial situation.
Right.
And Lydia, she talked about her benefactor masturbating outside her apartment.
Oh my.
And her neighbor saw it, which made her finally cut off contact.
Wow, so that was the final straw for her.
Yeah. And then Cora, she felt pressured to endure groping just to get what she wanted from her benefactor.
So there's this real sense of vulnerability and lack of control.
Absolutely.
But the study also looked at how these women tried to protect themselves, right?
Yeah, and this is where Power 2 comes back in.
Okay.
Because even though most of them felt like the overall risk in sugar relationships wasn't necessarily higher than in traditional dating,
Right.
they still took precautions.
Okay.
And for many of them, that act of protecting themselves was empowering in itself.
What were some of the things they did?
Well, common strategies included screening potential benefactors before meeting,
Okay.
insisting on meeting in public places, having a friend nearby,
Right.
and always letting someone know where they were going.
So basic safety precautions.
Yeah, exactly. But some women went even further.
Okay.
Like Casey, she actually created fake identities,
Mm-hmm.
different emails, names, even a registered business name,
Wow.
so she could keep her real identity hidden.
That's pretty smart.
Yeah, and she also used a separate texting app so she wouldn't have to give out her personal number.
Right. And then there were those who took physical measures to protect themselves.
Yeah, Camille mentioned carrying a taser, knives, even a scalpel,
Oh, wow.
and she would sometimes show them as a deterrent.
Mm.
And Lynn preferred having encounters at her own apartment
Okay.
because she had weapons hidden there that she could access easily.
So they were really taking their safety into their own hands.
Yeah, and it's interesting to compare this to some research from Denmark,
Okay.
where they found that safety was also a big concern for women in sugar relationships.
Hmm.
But the women in Scull's study actually reported less extreme violence,
Okay.
and they used similar self-protection techniques.
So it sounds like the power dynamics in sugar relationships are incredibly complex and can really vary depending on the situation and the people involved.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Power isn't fixed in these relationships. It's not like one person always has it and the other doesn't.
Right.
It's fluid, it changes, it depends on the context.
And these relationships aren't just inherently good or bad.
Exactly. It's not like they're automatically empowering or disempowering. The reality is much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
And the way each woman experiences power is unique.
So just to remind our listeners, the study identified 3 main ways these women thought about power.
Right. There was power over, which was about having control over things like money, time, attention, and appearance.
Okay.
Then there was power two, which was about having agency in their sexual interactions and being able to keep themselves safe.
Right.
And then, of course, there was power as domination, which is the more negative side, where they experienced coercion, harassment, things like that.
And it sounds like being financially dependent on a benefactor could really decrease a woman's sense of power.
Yeah, for sure. But, there's this idea out there that these relationships are inherently unequal by design.
Right.
And while there's truth to that in some cases, I think it's an oversimplification.
Yeah, because not all of these women were desperate for money.
Exactly. And they weren't all relying on those websites, like Seeking.com.
Right.
Only about a third of the women in this study even used that site.
So it's not as straightforward as some people might think.
No, not at all.
Were there any other findings that surprised you?
Yeah, the fact that so many women felt empowered simply by controlling their time and attention,
Mm-hmm.
and how many of the benefactors were actually willing to accommodate their schedules, that was pretty interesting.
Right. It wasn't all about the money.
Yeah, it goes beyond that. And actually, that aligns with some other research that's been done,
Okay.
which suggests that women in these relationships often feel powerful based on more than just finances.
Like what?
Well, things like the emotional investment from the benefactor, the feeling of being valued beyond just their physical attributes.
Right. And the role of appearance was also more complex than some people might assume, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, appearance definitely played a role, especially in attracting benefactors initially.
Right.
But it wasn't the only source of power for these women.
Okay.
Like Janet's story is a good example of that.
Right. She didn't fit that typical image.
Exactly. And, the research also highlighted how race and these appearance hierarchies play out in the sugar dating world.
Yeah, we talk about that.
And I think that's something that really needs more research.
Right, to understand how racism and intersecting identities impact these relationships.
Absolutely.
And in terms of sexual interactions, it really was a mixed bag, wasn't it?
Yeah, there were definitely women who felt empowered by having control over those interactions.
Okay.
Some even experienced pleasure.
But there was also pressure and coercion.
Yeah, especially for those who were more financially vulnerable.
Right, and that echoes existing research on transactional sex.
Exactly.
And how the lines of consent can get really blurry in those situations.
It's a complicated area.
And we can't forget about the issue of safety, which was clearly a major concern for many of the women.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see how they took steps to protect themselves.
Right?
And sometimes even those actions were a source of empowerment.
So what does all of this tell us about power in general? Like, what are the bigger theoretical implications here?
Well, I think this study really supports the idea that power is not this fixed thing. It's what some scholars call polymorphous. This meaning it can take many different forms. It can shift and change depending on the situation.
Right. And it's also relational.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not just about one individual. It's about how people interact with each other within a relationship.
So it's much more complex than just saying one person has power and the other doesn't.
Yeah, and, what might seem like a disempowering situation on the surface can actually become a source of power depending on how someone interprets it
Okay.
and the dynamics of that specific relationship.
So context is key.
Absolutely.
Now, before we wrap up, what are some of the limitations of this research?
Well, it mainly focused on cisgender women, which is a limitation.
Right.
And the data was collected a few years ago, so things might have changed since then.
Yeah.
The sugar dating landscape is constantly evolving.
So where do we go from here? Like, what kind of research is still needed?
Well, I think it would be really valuable to get the perspectives of male benefactors
Okay.
and male sugar babies.
Yeah.
And people who identify as non-binary or transgender.
Right.